In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where secrets echo through centuries-old walls, a marriage that the world thought was unbreakable began to fracture. King Charles III, the man who waited decades to marry his true love, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping beside him. What happens when the fairy tale ending becomes a nightmare? When the king who gave up everything for love discovers that love might not be enough. This is the untold story of how Britain's most enduring royal romance nearly destroyed itself from within, threatening not just a marriage, but the very foundation of the modern monarchy. Behind the carefully orchestrated public appearances and perfectly timed photo opportunities lay a truth so shocking that palace insiders still whisper about it in hushed tones. This is the story of how Queen Camilla's secret actions pushed King Charles to the breaking point, creating a cold divide that would shake the very walls of the palace and force a king to choose between his crown and his heart. Some love stories are meant to inspire. Others serve as warnings. This is both. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III stood at his bedroom window, watching his wife tend to her roses. From this distance, Camilla looked peaceful, content even, her silver hair catching the light as she moved gracefully between the flower beds. To any observer, this would have appeared to be a scene of domestic bliss, a king and queen enjoying the simple pleasures of married life. But Charles knew better. He had been watching his wife more carefully these past few months, studying her movements, her expressions, her carefully chosen words. What he had discovered beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage had shaken him to his very core. The transformation had been subtle at first. Camilla had always been private, even secretive about certain aspects of her life. During their long courtship and the early years of their marriage, Charles had attributed this to her natural discretion and the lessons learned from decades of living under intense media scrutiny. Privacy, after all, was a luxury that few members of the royal family could afford. But this was different. This was deception. It had started with small inconsistencies. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Meetings that weren't reflected in the official court calendar. Conversations with palace staff that ceased the moment he appeared. At first, Charles had dismissed these incidents as mere coincidence or perhaps matters related to her charitable work that required confidentiality. Then came the financial discrepancies. Charles had always maintained a close relationship with his personal secretary and private financial advisors. As king, every expenditure, every donation, every financial transaction was carefully documented and reviewed. It was during one of these routine reviews that his private secretary, James Morrison, had approached him with concerns about certain unauthorized expenses linked to accounts that Camilla had access to. The numbers themselves weren't staggering by royal standards, but the pattern was troubling. Regular payments to individuals who weren't on any official palace payroll. Transfers to accounts that couldn't be easily traced. Most concerning of all, these transactions appeared to coincide with periods when Camilla claimed to be engaged in private charitable work or personal family matters. When Charles had first confronted his wife about these irregularities, her response had been both swift and rehearsed. She explained that she had been quietly supporting several causes that she preferred to keep private, away from the public eye and media attention. These were personal charitable contributions, she insisted, funded from her own allowances and discretionary funds. The explanation had seemed reasonable, even admirable. Camilla had always been passionate about causes related to domestic violence, literacy, and animal welfare. The idea that she might be funding these efforts privately, without seeking public recognition or media coverage, aligned perfectly with the woman Charles thought he knew. But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing in the dark. Charles had begun to notice other changes in his wife's behavior. She had become increasingly involved in what she described as private consultations with various organizations and individuals. These meetings often took place away from official royal residences, sometimes in locations that seemed oddly inappropriate for charitable work. There were the unexplained trips to meetings that never appeared on any official schedule. Conversations with people whose backgrounds seemed inconsistent with legitimate charitable or royal business. Most troubling of all, there were the phone calls, often conducted in hushed tones and frequently interrupted when Charles or other family members were present. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier during what should have been a routine family dinner at Windsor Castle. Prince William and Catherine had joined them, along with several close friends of the family. The conversation had been light, focused on upcoming royal engagements and family plans for the summer months. During the dinner, Camilla's phone had buzzed repeatedly. Each time, she had glanced at the screen with an expression that Charles had come to recognize as anxiety mixed with anticipation. Finally, she had excused herself from the table, claiming an urgent call related to one of her patronages. The call had lasted nearly 30 minutes. When Camilla returned, her demeanor had changed completely. She appeared distracted, almost agitated, and struggled to re-engage with the dinner conversation. William had noticed the change as well, exchanging concerned glances with his father across the table. It was Catherine who had later pulled Charles aside, expressing her own concerns about Camilla's recent behavior. As someone who had experienced her own struggles with media attention and public scrutiny, Catherine was particularly sensitive to changes in family dynamics and mental health. The conversation with Catherine had forced Charles to confront a truth he had been trying to avoid. His wife was involved in something that she felt compelled to hide from him, something significant enough to affect her behavior and their marriage. That night, alone in his study, Charles had made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He instructed his most trusted security advisor to conduct a discreet investigation into Camilla's recent activities and associations. The request had been made with a heavy heart. Charles understood the implications of what he was asking. To investigate one's own spouse suggested a level of distrust that was fundamentally incompatible with marriage. But he also understood his responsibilities as king, not just to his family but to the institution of the monarchy and to the British people. The initial report had arrived on his desk 5 days later, contained in a plain manila envelope marked only with his private seal. What he read had changed everything. The investigation revealed a web of relationships and financial transactions that painted a picture of his wife that Charles barely recognized. The charitable work that Camilla claimed to be supporting privately appeared to be largely fabricated. Instead, the money was flowing to individuals and organizations with questionable backgrounds and unclear purposes. More troubling still were the personal relationships that Camilla had been cultivating. Several of her regular contacts were individuals with histories of questionable business practices, some with connections to media organizations known for their aggressive pursuit of royal stories. The most damaging revelation concerned a series of meetings that Camilla had been having with a particular individual, someone with a reputation for brokering information and influence. The nature of these meetings wasn't entirely clear from the investigation, but the pattern suggested an ongoing relationship that had been deliberately concealed. As Charles sat in his study that evening, reading and rereading the report, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his marriage and his wife. The woman he had loved for decades, the woman he had waited so long to marry, the woman who had stood by his side as he ascended to the throne, was involved in activities that she felt compelled to hide from him. The implications were staggering. If Camilla was involved in anything that could compromise the integrity of the monarchy or damage the reputation of the royal family, it would affect not just their marriage but the institution itself. The very foundations of his reign could be threatened by his wife's secret activities. But beyond the institutional concerns lay a more personal and painful reality. The marriage that Charles had fought so hard to achieve, the relationship that had sustained him through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges, was built on a foundation that was apparently far more fragile than he had ever imagined. That night, Charles had lain awake beside his sleeping wife, studying her face in the dim light that filtered through the bedroom curtains. The woman beside him looked peaceful, innocent even, her breathing steady and deep. But Charles could no longer see her without thinking about the secrets she was keeping, the lies she had told, the trust that had been broken. The investigation had provided facts, but it had also raised more questions than it answered. What was Camilla really doing during these secret meetings? What was she hoping to accomplish? And, perhaps most importantly, how long had she been living this double life? As dawn approached, Charles had made a decision that would define the rest of his reign and his marriage. He would confront Camilla directly, presenting her with the evidence and demanding complete honesty about her activities. But he would also prepare himself for the possibility that the confrontation might end their marriage and forever change the nature of the modern British monarchy. The perfect facade that they had maintained for so long was about to crumble, and Charles wasn't sure that anything they had built together would survive the collapse. Standing now at his bedroom window, watching his wife tend to her roses as if nothing had changed, Charles felt the weight of the coming confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. In a few hours, he would present Camilla with the evidence of her deception and demand the truth that their marriage and his reign desperately needed. The conversation that was about to take place would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the very character of the monarchy that Charles had dedicated his life to serving. As he watched his wife move among her flowers, Charles realized that he was about to discover whether the woman he had loved for so long was still the woman he thought he had married. The morning sun continued to rise, casting away the shadows and illuminating everything in sharp, unforgiving detail. Soon, there would be nowhere left to hide. The grandfather clock in Charles's private study chimed 11 times as he arranged the documents on his mahogany desk with methodical precision. Each page represented another piece of evidence, another crack in the foundation of trust that had sustained his marriage for so many years. The manila folder lay open before him like an accusation, its contents casting shadows across everything he had believed about his wife. Camilla entered the study with her usual grace, carrying a tea service on a silver tray that had belonged to Queen Mary. Her smile was warm and genuine as she set the tray down, completely unaware that the man she had shared breakfast with just hours earlier was now studying her every movement for signs of deception. "I thought you might need some tea," she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of affection and concern that had comforted Charles through countless difficult moments over the years. "You seemed distracted this morning." Charles watched his wife pour the tea, noting the steady hands and calm demeanor that betrayed no hint of anxiety or guilt. Either Camilla was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, or she had become far more accomplished at deception than he had ever imagined. "Please sit down," Charles said, his voice carefully neutral. "We need to talk." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the moment. Camilla's movements became more deliberate as she settled into the leather armchair across from his desk, her eyes searching his face for clues about what was to come. "Is everything all right? You've seemed troubled lately." The concern in her voice was genuine, and for a moment Charles felt his resolve waver. This was the woman who had supported him through his mother's death, who had stood beside him during his coronation, who had helped him navigate the complex transition from prince to king. Could this same woman really be capable of the deception outlined in the report before him? "I've received some information," Charles began carefully, "that I find deeply troubling. Information about activities that you've been involved in, activities that you've chosen not to share with me." Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief flash of something that might have been panic crossing her features before being replaced by puzzled concern. "I'm not sure what you mean. What activities?" Charles opened the folder and removed the first document, a detailed financial report showing the unauthorized transactions that had first raised suspicions. He placed it on the desk between them, watching as Camilla's eyes scanned the columns of figures and account numbers. "These are financial records showing regular payments from accounts linked to your office. Payments to individuals who don't appear on any official palace payroll or charity registration. Payments that coincide with meetings that never appeared on any official schedule." Camilla picked up the document, her hands steady as she examined the details. When she looked up, her expression was more confused than defensive. "Charles, I told you about this months ago. These are private charitable contributions, personal donations that I prefer to keep confidential." "I thought you understood." "I did understand," Charles replied, his voice gaining strength, "until I learned that many of these supposed charitable recipients have no legitimate charitable operations. Until I discovered that several of them have connections to media organizations and information brokers." He placed another document on the desk, this one containing background checks and professional histories of the individuals who had been receiving payments. Camilla's face grew pale as she recognized some of the names. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I'm not suggesting anything," Charles replied firmly. "I'm stating facts. You have been secretly meeting with individuals who make their living selling information and influence. You have been making financial payments to these same individuals, and you have been deliberately concealing these activities from me and from your official staff." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Camilla set the documents back on the desk and leaned back in her chair, her composure beginning to crack under the weight of the evidence. "You had me investigated," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You had your own wife investigated like a criminal." "I had irregularities in royal finances investigated," Charles corrected. "Irregularities that led directly to you and to activities that you've been hiding from everyone around you." "What did you expect me to do when confronted with evidence that my wife might be compromising the integrity of the monarchy?" Camilla stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the same gardens where Charles had watched her that morning. Her silhouette against the bright afternoon light made her appear smaller, more vulnerable than the confident woman who had entered the room. "You don't understand," she said without turning around. "You don't understand the pressures, the expectations, the constant scrutiny. Everything I do is analyzed, criticized, compared to your previous wife. Every charitable endeavor is questioned. Every friendship is suspect." "That doesn't explain the secrecy," Charles said, his voice softening slightly at the pain he heard in her words. "It doesn't explain why you felt the need to hide these activities from me." Camilla turned back to face him, and Charles was shocked to see tears streaming down her face. In all their years together, through all the public scandals and private challenges, he had rarely seen his wife cry. "Because I knew you wouldn't approve," she said. "I knew you would see it as compromising, as dangerous to the monarchy. But, Charles, I was trying to protect us, to protect the family." "Protect us from what?" "From the stories that are coming," Camilla said, her voice gaining urgency. "Stories about our past, about decisions that were made, about people who were hurt. There are individuals who have been holding on to information for years, waiting for the right moment to use it." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. The implication of what she was saying was almost too terrible to contemplate. "You've been paying for silence," he said, the words heavy with disbelief and disappointment. "I've been managing threats," Camilla corrected. "Threats to our family, to our marriage, to your reign. There are people who would destroy everything we've built together if they thought it would serve their purposes. And you decided to handle this alone? Without consulting me, without involving our security advisors, without considering the legal implications of what you were doing. I was trying to protect you." Camilla's voice rose, her composure finally breaking completely. "I was trying to handle problems quietly so that you could focus on being king, so that our family could have some peace, so that the monarchy could move forward without being dragged down by scandals from our past." Charles stood and walked around his desk, facing his wife directly. The distance between them felt enormous despite the fact that they were only a few feet apart. "What scandals, Camilla? What past are you so afraid of having revealed?" She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that Charles had to strain to hear her. "There are recordings," she said. "Private conversations from years ago, conversations between us when we were both still married to other people. Conversations that would be extremely damaging if they became public." The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. He remembered those conversations, intimate discussions during the most difficult period of both their marriages. Conversations that had been recorded without their knowledge or consent, conversations that could indeed be devastating if they ever became public. "How long have you known about these recordings?" he asked. "Several years," Camilla admitted. "I was approached shortly after our wedding by someone who claimed to have them. Initially, they wanted money, but over time the demands became more complex. They wanted access to information about royal schedules, about family relationships, about private matters that they could use for other purposes." Charles felt the room spinning around him as the full implications of his wife's revelations became clear. She hadn't just been paying for silence. She had been providing information to individuals who could use that information to compromise the security and privacy of the entire royal family. "You've been feeding them information about our private lives," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You've been giving them access to details about our family, our schedules, our relationships." "Nothing that would put anyone in danger," Camilla said quickly. "Just small details, things they could have learned from other sources. I was trying to keep them satisfied with minor information so they wouldn't publish the recordings or make more serious demands." "Minor information?" Charles's voice rose to a level that he rarely allowed himself to reach. "There is no minor information when it comes to the royal family. Every detail of our lives can be used against us, against the monarchy, against the nation. How could you not understand that?" The study fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Camilla's quiet sobs. Charles looked at the woman he had loved for decades, the woman he had fought to marry, the woman who had become his queen, and realized that he no longer knew who she was. The accusations in the report had been troubling enough, but the reality of what Camilla had been doing was far worse than anything he had imagined. She hadn't just been deceiving him about her activities. She had been actively compromising the security of their family and the integrity of the monarchy in an attempt to protect secrets from their past. "Who else knows about this?" Charles asked, his practical mind already trying to assess the scope of the damage. "No one," Camilla said. "I've been handling it alone." "For how long can you continue to satisfy these people? What happens when they decide that small details aren't enough?" What happens when they demand access to state secrets or information that could compromise national security? Camilla looked up at him with an expression of complete despair. I don't know, she whispered. I've been living with this fear for so long that I stopped thinking about the future. I was just trying to get through each day, each demand, each threat. Charles walked back to his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. The documents spread before him suddenly seemed less important than the larger crisis that his wife had revealed. The monarchy that he had dedicated his life to serving was being threatened from within by the very person who should have been his closest ally and strongest protector. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect their marriage and his reign, Camilla had created a situation that threatened to destroy both. Her good intentions had led to a web of deception and compromise that could potentially bring down everything they had worked to build. As Charles looked across the desk at his wife, still crying quietly in her chair, he realized that their marriage had reached a crossroads from which there might be no return. The trust that had sustained them through decades of challenges had been shattered, and the foundation of their relationship had been undermined by the very secrets that Camilla had been trying to protect. The confrontation that Charles had planned as a way to get answers had instead opened up a chasm between them that seemed impossible to bridge. And somewhere in London, there were people with recordings and information that could destroy not just their marriage, but the very institution of the monarchy itself. The perfect facade they had maintained was indeed crumbling, and Charles was beginning to understand that the collapse might be far more complete and devastating than he had ever imagined. The days following the confrontation in Charles's study passed with the mechanical precision of royal routine, but the warmth that had once characterized the private moments between the king and queen had vanished completely. They continued to appear together at public engagements, their practiced smiles and coordinated gestures maintaining the illusion of a united royal couple. But behind the palace walls, an Arctic chill had settled over their relationship. Charles found himself studying his wife during their public appearances, watching for signs of the deception that he now knew she was capable of. Every smile seemed calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every word carefully chosen for its public impact rather than its private truth. The woman standing beside him at charity events and state dinners felt like a stranger wearing his wife's face. The revelation about the recordings and the years of payments had shattered something fundamental in Charles's understanding of their marriage. It wasn't just that Camilla had lied to him. It was that she had been living an entirely separate life, managing threats and making decisions that affected their entire family without ever consulting him or seeking his guidance. In the weeks since their confrontation, Charles had met privately with his most trusted advisors to assess the scope of the security threat that Camilla's actions had created. The picture that emerged was even more troubling than he had initially feared. Sir Michael Stevens, the royal family's chief security advisor, had presented a comprehensive analysis of the potential vulnerabilities that had been created by years of information sharing. The details that Camilla had provided to her contacts might have seemed minor to her, but when compiled together they created a detailed map of royal family movements, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The pattern of information sharing suggests a level of access that could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands, Sir Michael had explained during their private meeting. Schedule details, family dynamics, personal relationships, security procedures. Individually, these might seem harmless, but collectively they represent a significant intelligence asset for anyone seeking to compromise or exploit the royal family. Even more concerning was the realization that some of the individuals who had been receiving information and payments from Camilla had connections to foreign intelligence services. What had begun as an attempt to suppress embarrassing recordings had potentially evolved into something approaching espionage. Charles had requested a complete security review of all royal residences and protocols, a process that would necessarily involve briefing other senior members of the royal family about the nature of the threat. The prospect of having to explain to William and Catherine, and Edward, that their security had been compromised by his wife's secret activities filled Charles with a sense of shame and failure that kept him awake at night. But the professional concerns, serious as they were, paled in comparison to the personal devastation that Charles was experiencing. The woman he had waited decades to marry, the woman who had been his closest confidant and strongest supporter, had been living a double life for years. Every intimate conversation they had shared during that time was now tainted by the knowledge that she was simultaneously betraying his trust. The evenings were the worst. Their private dinners had become exercises in polite conversation punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. Camilla would attempt to discuss the day's events or upcoming engagements, but Charles found himself analyzing every word she spoke for hidden meanings or ulterior motives. 3 days after their confrontation, Camilla had attempted to bridge the growing divide between them. She had prepared his favorite meal and arranged for them to dine alone in their private quarters, away from the staff and formal protocols of royal dining. "Charles," she had said as they sat across from each other at the intimate table, "we need to find a way through this. We can't continue living like strangers in the same house." Charles had looked up from his untouched plate, studying the woman across from him. She appeared genuinely distressed by the distance that had grown between them, but he could no longer trust his ability to read her emotional state accurately. "I don't know how to move forward," he had replied honestly. "Everything I thought I knew about our marriage has been called into question. I don't know what's real and what's been carefully constructed for my benefit." "My love for you is real," Camilla had said, her eyes filling with tears. "Everything else might have been misguided or wrong, but my love for you has never been in question. Your love for me led you to compromise the security of our entire family," Charles had responded, his voice colder than he had intended. "Your love for me caused you to make decisions that could potentially threaten the monarchy itself. I'm having difficulty understanding how those actions reflect love rather than selfishness." The conversation had ended with Camilla leaving the table in tears, and Charles sitting alone with his thoughts and his untouched dinner. The distance between them had only grown wider since then. Charles had begun spending his evenings in his private study, reviewing state papers and correspondence late into the night rather than retiring to the bedroom he shared with his wife. The bed that had once been a sanctuary for intimate conversation and quiet companionship had become another reminder of how much of their life together had been built on incomplete truths. The impact of the crisis was beginning to affect other aspects of Charles's life and reign. His concentration during official meetings was compromised by his preoccupation with the personal crisis. Senior government officials had begun to notice his distraction during briefings and official consultations. During a particularly important meeting with the Prime Minister about upcoming international diplomatic visits, Charles had found his attention wandering to questions about his wife's activities rather than focusing on matters of state. The realization that his personal crisis was beginning to affect his performance as king added another layer of stress and guilt to an already overwhelming situation. The Prime Minister, a perceptive woman who had worked with Charles since his accession to the throne, had noticed his distraction and had gently inquired about his well-being. Charles had been forced to provide reassurances about his health and state of mind, while internally questioning whether those reassurances were entirely accurate. Perhaps most painfully, the crisis was beginning to affect Charles's relationships with other members of his family. William had called several times expressing concern about the change in dynamics that he had noticed during family gatherings. The easy warmth that had characterized family dinners and private celebrations had been replaced by a tension that was impossible to ignore. "Father, is everything all right between you and Camilla?" William had asked during a private conversation after a particularly strained family lunch. "Catherine and I have both noticed that something seems different." Charles had been forced to deflect his son's concerns while internally struggling with the knowledge that he would eventually need to brief William about the security implications of Camilla's actions. As heir to the throne, William had a right to know about threats to the monarchy, but Charles dreaded having to explain that those threats came from within their own family. The isolation that Charles was experiencing was profound and complete. He could not share the details of the crisis with his children without potentially damaging their relationship with Camilla permanently. He could not confide in friends without risking the security of sensitive information. Even his most trusted advisors, while professionally supportive, could not provide the emotional support that he desperately needed. During his morning walks through the palace gardens, Charles found himself remembering the early days of his relationship with Camilla, when their love had seemed pure and uncomplicated despite the external pressures they faced. Those memories now felt like artifacts from a different life, tainted by the knowledge of what that relationship had become. The recordings that Camilla had been trying to suppress were particularly haunting. Charles remembered those conversations, intimate discussions during the most difficult period of both their marriages. At the time, they had represented moments of honest connection in lives that were otherwise constrained by duty and public expectation. Now, the knowledge that those private moments had been captured and weaponized by unknown individuals, made Charles feel violated in a way that went beyond mere betrayal. The strategic implications of the situation were becoming clearer as Charles worked with his security advisors to assess the damage. The information that Camilla had provided over the years could be used to compromise future security arrangements, to predict royal family movements, or to exploit personal relationships for intelligence purposes. More troubling still was the realization that the individuals who had been receiving information from Camilla had almost certainly been sharing that information with others. What had begun as a private matter between Camilla and her blackmailers had likely evolved into a much larger intelligence operation involving multiple parties with various agendas. The recordings themselves remained a significant threat. Charles had no way of knowing how many copies existed, who controlled them, or when they might be used. The sword of Damocles that Camilla had been trying to avoid through her payments and information sharing was still hanging over their heads, potentially more dangerous now than it had been before her intervention. As Charles sat in his study late one evening, reviewing the latest security assessment, he realized that his marriage had reached a point where trust might never be fully restored. Even if Camilla could find a way to extricate herself from the web of obligations she had created, even if the immediate security threats could be neutralized, the fundamental damage to their relationship might be irreparable. The woman sleeping in the bedroom down the hall was still legally his wife, still officially the queen consort, still the person he had once trusted above all others. But she was also the person who had demonstrated that she was capable of sustained deception, poor judgment, and actions that put their entire family at risk. The cold divide that had opened between them felt as vast and unbridgeable as an Arctic chasm. Charles was beginning to understand that some betrayals are too profound to heal, some trust too completely shattered to rebuild. The perfect marriage that they had presented to the world had been revealed as an illusion, and Charles was no longer certain that there was anything real left to salvage from the wreckage. Standing at his window, looking out at the gardens where he had watched his wife just days earlier, Charles realized that he was facing not just a marriage crisis, but a fundamental choice about the kind of king he wanted to be. Could he continue to reign effectively while living with a spouse he could no longer trust? Could he maintain his commitment to the monarchy while his personal life was built on deception and compromise? The answers to those questions would determine not just the future of his marriage, but the legacy of his reign and the character of the modern British monarchy itself. The crisis that had been simmering beneath the surface of the royal marriage finally erupted into the public sphere on a gray Tuesday morning in November. Charles was reviewing diplomatic correspondence in his study when Sir Michael Stevens burst through the doors without the usual protocol of requesting an audience, his face pale and his manner urgent. "Your Majesty," he said, slightly out of breath from what had clearly been a hurried journey to the study. "We have a significant problem. The recordings have been released." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He set down his fountain pen with deliberate care, his mind immediately racing through the implications of what this development meant for his family, his marriage, and his reign. "Where?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his chest. "Multiple platforms simultaneously," Sir Michael replied, placing a tablet on the desk that displayed several news websites and social media feeds. "The major newspapers received copies overnight, and excerpts are already being broadcast on television and radio. The full recordings appear to have been uploaded to various online platforms." Charles picked up the tablet, scanning the headlines that seemed to blur together in a cacophony of sensationalism and scandal. "Private royal conversations revealed, intimate recordings rock palace, the king's secret confessions." Each headline felt like another nail in the coffin of his privacy and dignity. "How extensive are the releases?" Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. "At least 6 separate conversations spanning several years," Sir Michael replied. "The content is deeply personal. Discussions about your marriages, your children, intimate details about family relationships. The most damaging appears to be a conversation where you both discuss the challenges of managing public perception while dealing with personal feelings." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, remembering those conversations. They had been recorded during some of the most difficult periods of both their marriages, when they had found comfort in each other's honesty about their struggles with duty, love, and public expectation. The idea that those private moments of vulnerability were now being consumed by millions of people around the world felt like a violation so profound that it threatened to overwhelm him completely. "What has been the initial public reaction?" he asked, opening his eyes to face whatever damage had already been done. Sir Michael hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver more bad news. The response has been intense. Social media is flooded with commentary, much of it critical. Several members of parliament have already issued statements calling for investigations into royal conduct. The Archbishop of Canterbury has been contacted for comment about the moral implications of the revelations. Before Charles could respond, his private secretary knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, another breach of protocol that indicated the severity of the crisis. "Your Majesty, the Queen Consort is requesting an urgent meeting. She's in considerable distress and insists that she needs to speak with you immediately." Charles felt a complex mixture of anger, pity, and exhaustion at the thought of facing his wife at this moment. The recordings that were now destroying his reputation and threatening his reign were the same recordings that Camilla had been trying to suppress through her years of secret payments and information sharing. Her efforts to protect them from this exact scenario had not only failed but had potentially made the situation worse by compromising royal security. "Send her in," Charles said, steeling himself for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of their marriage. Camilla entered the study in a state that Charles had rarely seen. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears, and her hands shaking visibly as she approached his desk. She looked like a woman on the verge of complete emotional collapse. "Charles, I'm so sorry," she began before she had even taken a seat. "This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. I thought I could manage the situation. I thought I could keep this from happening." "Your attempts to manage the situation have made everything worse," Charles replied, his voice colder than he had intended. "Your payments and information sharing didn't prevent this release. They simply delayed it while creating additional security vulnerabilities for our entire family." "I know," Camilla said, collapsing into the chair across from his desk. "I know I made everything worse. But, Charles, you have to understand, I was terrified. I was terrified of exactly what's happening right now." Charles looked at his wife, seeing not the composed and dignified queen consort that the public knew, but a woman who had been living in fear for years. The revelation that Camilla had been carrying this burden alone, making increasingly desperate decisions in an attempt to protect their marriage and his reign, added layers of complexity to his anger and disappointment. "The damage assessments are still coming in," Sir Michael interjected, "but the initial indicators suggest significant impact on royal approval ratings and public confidence in the monarchy." Charles picked up the tablet again, scrolling through news articles and social media commentary. The reactions range from expressions of sympathy for the invasion of privacy to harsh criticisms of royal conduct and calls for Republican reforms. The conversations that had been private expressions of human vulnerability were being analyzed, criticized, and weaponized by commentators with various political and personal agendas. "What's our response strategy?" Charles asked, switching into the practical mode that had sustained him through previous crises. "The communications team is preparing several options," Sir Michael replied. "We can emphasize the invasion of privacy aspect, we can acknowledge the content while providing context, or we can maintain silence and allow the story to develop without royal commentary." "None of those options address the core problem," Charles said. "The recordings are real, the conversations happened, and the content is damaging regardless of how we frame our response." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the crowds of media that had already gathered outside the palace gates. The scene reminded him of the darkest days following Diana's death, when the monarchy had faced existential questions about its relevance and moral authority. "There's something else," Camilla said quietly from her chair. "The people who released the recordings, they contacted me this morning. They're threatening to release additional material unless..." "Unless what?" Charles asked, turning back to face his wife. "Unless I provide them with current information about royal family security protocols and upcoming private engagements," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. The implications of this demand hit Charles with stunning force. The individuals behind the recordings weren't just interested in embarrassing the royal family. They were actively seeking to compromise royal security for purposes that could only be described as hostile to the monarchy and potentially to national interests. "You see what your attempts to manage this situation have led to," Charles said, his voice rising despite his efforts to maintain control. "Your payments and information sharing didn't buy silence. They identified you as a source that could be exploited for increasingly sensitive intelligence." "I know," Camilla said. "I know I've made terrible mistakes. But, Charles, what do we do now? How do we protect the family from what's coming?" Sir Michael cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, if I may suggest, this situation now requires coordination with security services and potentially law enforcement. The demands being made of the Queen Consort constitute extortion and potentially treasonous activities. Charles nodded, recognizing that the crisis had evolved beyond a private family matter into something that threatened the security of the state itself. The recordings were damaging enough, but the ongoing extortion attempts represented a direct attack on the institutional foundations of the monarchy. What would involving security services mean for the Queen Consort? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. A full investigation into her activities, her contacts, and her financial transactions over the past several years, Sir Michael replied. The process would necessarily become public, and the Queen Consort would likely face criminal charges related to the information sharing that has already taken place. Charles looked at his wife, seeing the full scope of the choices that lay before them. They could attempt to handle the current crisis privately, leaving the royal family vulnerable to ongoing extortion and security threats. Or they could involve law enforcement and security services, a process that would likely end Camilla's role as Queen Consort and potentially result in her imprisonment. I need time to consider our options, Charles said. Sir Michael, please prepare a comprehensive briefing on the security implications and legal requirements. I also need immediate briefings for William and other senior family members about the nature of the threats we're facing. After Sir Michael left the study, Charles and Camilla sat in silence for several minutes. The sound of helicopters circling overhead and the distant noise of crowds outside the palace provided a constant reminder of the public nature of their private crisis. Charles, Camilla said finally, I want you to know that whatever you decide, whatever needs to be done to protect the monarchy and the family, I'll accept it. I know I've created this situation through my own poor choices. Charles looked at the woman he had loved for decades, the woman who had become his wife and queen, the woman whose attempts to protect their marriage had instead threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The pain in her eyes was genuine, but it was overshadowed by the magnitude of the crisis she had created and the impossible choices that now lay before them. I don't know if our marriage can survive this, Charles said, speaking the truth that had been weighing on him for days. I don't know if it should survive this. I know, Camilla replied, tears streaming down her face. I know that I may have destroyed everything that mattered most to me in trying to protect it. As Charles sat in his study that evening, alone with the weight of decisions that would reshape not only his marriage but his reign, he realized that he had reached the breaking point that he had been trying to avoid. The perfect facade had not just crumbled, it had exploded in a very public way that left no possibility of reconstruction. The recordings were out, the extortion was continuing, and the security of the royal family was compromised. The woman he had married was revealed to be someone capable of deception and poor judgment on a scale that threatened the very institution he had sworn to protect and serve. The choices before him were stark and unforgiving. He could stand by his wife and face the ongoing security threats and public criticism that would define the rest of his reign. Or he could take the steps necessary to protect the monarchy, steps that would almost certainly end his marriage and forever change the nature of the modern royal family. As the helicopters continued to circle overhead and the crowds continued to gather outside the palace gates, Charles realized that the breaking point he had been dreading was not just approaching, it had arrived, and there was no going back to the life they had known before. The emergency meeting of the Privy Council was called for 6 o'clock on the morning following the release of the recordings, an unprecedented gathering that brought together the most senior advisors to the crown in the ornate chambers of Windsor Castle. Charles entered the room to find a collection of faces that reflected the gravity of the crisis. The Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and several senior peers whose loyalty to the monarchy had been tested through decades of service. The discussion that followed was unlike any in the modern history of the monarchy. For the first time since the abdication crisis of 1936, the Privy Council was being asked to consider actions that could fundamentally alter the structure and leadership of the royal family. The security assessment is clear, Sir Michael Stevens reported to the assembled group. The information that has been shared over the past several years has created vulnerabilities that extend far beyond the royal family to matters of national security. The ongoing extortion attempts represent a direct threat to the crown and to the state. The Prime Minister, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain from managing the political fallout of the crisis, addressed the room with unusual directness. The public reaction has been more severe than anticipated. We're seeing calls for parliamentary investigations, Republican movements gaining momentum, and significant damage to the soft power that the monarchy represents internationally. The situation requires decisive action to restore confidence in the institution. Charles listened to the assessments and recommendations with a sense of detachment that surprised him. The woman whose actions were being dissected and analyzed was his wife, his closest companion for decades, the person who had stood beside him during his coronation. Yet the institutional imperatives were clear, and his role as king demanded that he place the welfare of the monarchy above his personal relationships. The Archbishop of Canterbury, whose moral authority carried particular weight in matters affecting the crown, spoke with measured gravity. Your Majesty faces a choice between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. The Church's position has always been that marriage is a sacred covenant, but that covenant cannot supersede the obligations that come with the crown. The question before us is whether the Queen Consort's actions have made it impossible for her to continue in her role without compromising the moral authority of the monarchy. The words hung in the air like a judgment already rendered. Charles understood that he was not really being asked to make a decision. He was being presented with the inevitable conclusion of his wife's actions and his own responsibilities as king. What are the procedural options? Charles asked, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. The Lord Chancellor opened a leather folder containing documents that Charles recognized as legal opinions and constitutional precedents. There are several paths available, Your Majesty. The Queen Consort could voluntarily withdraw from public duties while maintaining her title, similar to the arrangement with the Duke of York following his recent difficulties. Alternatively, there could be a formal separation that would remove her from official royal roles while preserving the marriage in name. The most extreme option would be divorce proceedings, which would completely sever her connection to the crown. Charles had spent sleepless nights considering these same options, weighing the personal cost against the institutional necessities. Each path represented a different kind of ending to the marriage and the life they had built together. There's also the matter of criminal liability, the Prime Minister added. The intelligence services have made it clear that formal charges will need to be filed related to the information sharing. The Queen Consort's cooperation with the investigation could influence the severity of those charges, but prosecution appears inevitable. The reality of Camilla facing criminal charges for her attempts to protect their marriage added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. The woman who had tried to save their relationship through misguided actions was now facing the possibility of imprisonment as a result of those same actions. After the Privy Council meeting concluded, Charles returned to his private apartments to find Camilla waiting in their sitting room. She had clearly been crying, but her composure had returned to some degree. She looked like someone who had accepted the inevitability of what was coming. I heard about the meeting, she said as Charles entered the room. I assume decisions have been made about my future. Charles sat down across from his wife, studying the face that had been such a source of comfort and love for so many years. Even now, facing the end of their marriage and the destruction of everything they had built together, he could see traces of the woman he had fallen in love with decades earlier. The situation is untenable, he said gently. Your continued role as Queen Consort would compromise the security and moral authority of the monarchy. The Privy Council is unanimous in their assessment that changes must be made. What kind of changes? Camilla asked, though Charles suspected she already knew the answer. You would need to withdraw from all official royal duties immediately. Your titles and privileges as Queen Consort would be suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Depending on the results of that investigation, we would need to consider permanent changes to your status, including divorce, Camilla said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than emotional. The possibility has been discussed, Charles confirmed. The decision would depend partly on your cooperation with the investigation and partly on the ongoing security assessment. They sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the end of a marriage that had survived decades of public scrutiny, family opposition, and personal challenges, only to be destroyed by the very efforts that had been intended to protect it. I want you to know, Camilla said finally, that I never intended for any of this to happen. Every decision I made was motivated by my desire to protect you, to protect us, to protect the future of the monarchy. I understand that my judgment was catastrophically wrong, but my intentions were never malicious. Charles believed her. Despite everything that had happened, despite the deception and the security breaches and the ongoing crisis, he believed that Camilla had been trying to protect their marriage rather than destroy it. The tragedy was that her misguided attempts at protection had achieved the exact opposite of what she had intended. "I know," he said, "but intentions don't change the consequences of actions. The damage to the monarchy, to our family, to the security of the state, is real regardless of what you were trying to accomplish." Over the following weeks, the process of dismantling Camilla's role as queen consort proceeded with the efficiency and discretion that the palace had perfected through centuries of managing royal crises. Her official duties were quietly transferred to other members of the royal family. Her security detail was modified to reflect her changed status. Her personal staff was reassigned or dismissed. The criminal investigation proceeded in parallel with the administrative changes. Camilla's cooperation with law enforcement was complete and apparently genuine, providing details about her contacts, her financial transactions, and the information she had shared over the years. The full scope of the intelligence operation that had exploited her fears became clear through her testimony and supporting evidence. Charles found himself living through a strange period of transition, where the woman he had shared his life with was still technically his wife, but was no longer his partner in the duties and responsibilities of the crown. They continued to share the same residence, but their interactions had become formal and limited, more like diplomatic exchanges than intimate conversations between spouses. The public reaction to Camilla's withdrawal from royal duties was mixed but generally supportive of Charles's decision to prioritize institutional stability over personal relationships. Editorial commentary praised his willingness to make difficult decisions in the interest of the monarchy, while opinion polls showed a gradual recovery in royal approval ratings. The recordings themselves had gradually faded from the headlines as newer stories captured public attention. The initial shock and sensationalism had given way to more nuanced discussions about privacy, the pressures of royal life, and the challenges of maintaining personal relationships under constant public scrutiny. 3 months after the crisis began, Charles found himself alone in his study on a quiet Sunday evening, reviewing papers related to upcoming state visits and Commonwealth affairs. The routine of royal duties had provided a structure and purpose that helped him navigate the emotional complexity of his changed circumstances. A soft knock on the door interrupted his work. Camilla entered carrying a tea service, a gesture that reminded him of countless similar moments from their years together. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said, setting the tray on a side table rather than on his desk. "The lawyers have finalized the arrangements. I'll be moving to Raymill tomorrow." Charles looked up from his papers, realizing that this moment marked the formal end of their life together as husband and wife. The divorce proceedings had been handled with discretion and efficiency, minimizing public attention while ensuring that Camilla's separation from the crown was complete and permanent. "How are you feeling about the move?" he asked, genuinely concerned about her well-being despite everything that had happened. "Relieved, in some ways," Camilla replied honestly. "The constant uncertainty and scrutiny have been exhausting. I think we'll both be better able to move forward once there's clear separation between our lives." Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had watched his wife months earlier, before the crisis began. The scene looked the same, but everything else had changed irrevocably. "Do you regret it?" he asked without turning around. "The marriage, the years together, the choices that led us here?" "I regret the way it ended," Camilla said after a long pause. "I regret the mistakes I made and the damage I caused. But I don't regret loving you, and I don't regret the happiness we shared before everything went wrong." Charles turned back to face the woman who had been such a central part of his life for so many years. Despite the anger and disappointment and sense of betrayal that he had experienced, he recognized that she had paid a heavy price for her mistakes. The public humiliation, the criminal charges, the end of her marriage, and the loss of her role as queen consort represented consequences that were perhaps disproportionate to her intentions, if not to her actions. "I hope you'll be able to find peace in your new life," he said, meaning it sincerely. "And I hope that the monarchy will recover from the damage I caused," Camilla replied. "That was always my greatest fear, that my actions would harm the institution that you've dedicated your life to serving." After she left, Charles returned to his desk and his papers, but found it difficult to concentrate on the routine matters that required his attention. The silence in the study felt different from the comfortable quiet that had characterized his evening work sessions during his marriage. This was the silence of genuine solitude, of a life that had been fundamentally restructured around institutional rather than personal priorities. In the months that followed, Charles gradually adapted to his changed circumstances. His relationship with other family members deepened as they rallied around him during the crisis and its aftermath. His focus on royal duties intensified, perhaps as a way of channeling his energy away from personal regrets and toward the institutional responsibilities that remained constant regardless of his private circumstances. The monarchy did recover, as monarchies have always managed to do when faced with crises that seem existential at the time, but proved to be manageable through the institution's remarkable capacity for adaptation and survival. Charles's decision to prioritize the crown over his marriage was ultimately seen as evidence of his commitment to his role as king rather than as a personal failure. But, in the quiet moments, in the early morning hours when he walked through the palace gardens alone, Charles sometimes wondered whether the price of preserving the monarchy had been worth the cost to his personal happiness and to the woman who had loved him enough to make catastrophically poor decisions in an attempt to protect their future together. The cold divide that had opened between them had ultimately become an unbridgeable chasm, and the perfect facade that had once concealed their struggles had been replaced by a different kind of facade, one that concealed the loneliness and regret of a king who had chosen duty over love and found both the choice and its consequences to be more complex and painful than he had ever imagined.